It's the end of July, which means it's the end of Aussie Space Month here on Trekzone. But before we close out this special 4-part look at the Australian space industry, we've got just enough time for a clip show.
With thanks to spaceaustralia.com, this is Trekzone's Aussie Space Month. Beaming around the world across Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts and YouTube, this is the 8th season of the Trekzone Conversation with Matt Miller.
Earlier in the year, Dr. Brad Tucker and I covered some exciting developments in the Aussie space industry during our Stories of the Week segments on Talkin' Science. First up, back in February, the headquarters of the Aussie Space Agency were officially opened by our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison.
This wasn't, the launch of any formal work. It was the launch of their headquarters, but it's an important milestone. Part of it is having a presence, a physical presence. Part of it has a dedicated building and those sorts of things. People think of going and visiting the iconic NASA places. That's the kind of thing that you want. And so it's a step in, again, another step in that right direction of making the Australian Space Agency a permanent fixture, not only in space in Australia, but internationally, and you have to start with a headquarters.
The brilliant thing about the Australian Space Agency is that they're really tackling this, much like NASA, and who spreads across the United States. Our space agency is going to be doing the same thing with looking at launch sites in Queensland. I believe there's a launch site looking at the Eyre Peninsula in South Australia. Perth getting a robotics centre. We'll talk about that in a second. And Adelaide being the headquarters. So it really is spreading the love across the country.
That's right. And we have the national test facilities here in Canberra and others, and that was always the goal. When there was a lot of debate about where the headquarters would go, a lot of us in the community were saying, well, that's actually not the important bit, because headquarters are good, you need them, you need a central focus, but again, in that NASA model, you specialize in different things. If you're really going to have an impact, you need groups to specialize in certain areas and not just try and do everything. And it was also to unite that capability. There were groups around Australia doing lots of great things, so you don't just have to replicate it or reproduce it in a different location. It's kind of making it a united front, so to speak, for overseas and international partners, which really the Space Agency is trying to do. And this building is one of those steps.
And we've talked about it in the past about a crewed program of Australians heading up on our own missions. It's a long way off, if at all it will happen. We're almost like the other international partners of NASA, really, aren't we? Being a supporting role, but having said that, it is, the supporting roles are quite crucial.
I think it's playing an important thing that we just don't have to do everything on our own. And all of these space projects really are international projects. Any space telescope that you go up, when we were talking about Solar Orbiter the other week, it was mostly built by the Europeans, but NASA had an instrument. You can go back to the Chinese rover on the far side of the moon that was led by China, but had instruments from the Netherlands and Sweden and Saudi Arabia. So all of these groups are not just one single thing. And so the more centralized you have and the more coordination you have in a country means as a country in a whole, the groups in it can play a bigger part in those international projects. So that is where space is headed. Space is headed into very collaborative international projects that we're not only have seen in the past 20 years, but increasing, and that role in private industry and private company, which is a major focus of the Space Agency. So, it's starting off on the right feet, so to speak, with what the focuses are and where it should head. And
it really drives down the cost for each country to be collaborative, spread the cost, spread the love, spread the load, as it were. And the expertise. That's right, exactly.
It's good to have a little competition internally, but it's also make sure that you're not duplicating that work, that you can coordinate. Because if you don't, then you don't get the wide range of expertise that can need it. And it's also making sure that you're bringing the other sectors that aren't necessarily quite now doing space, but very needed. And Australia has identified this area of robotics as one of them, that with their expertise in mining and robotics in Australia, that plays a very direct role into space. So it's finding those ways of translating earthly matters for spacey matters.
And one could argue, too, that we have a lot more desert to simulate Mars and the moon than just, say, the test ranges in the United States.
That's right. You just have to, walk outside. It's half of Australia and it's Mars. So, we got that going for us.
In that same week, word was released about a world-class robotics factory that will be built in the Western Australian capital of Perth.
Robotics is a big thing that we can play a role in, but also it's uniting the states themselves. So it's figuring out which areas of the states, both the universities in those states, but also the private industries in those states can actually come together to focus. And again, WA is focusing on that robotics going into the mining and that sort of thing. Queensland touched on this as well. But, this is something we look at the Artemis missions and talks of asteroids and going to the moon and Mars. It is all about extraction of ice and other things on these places, and in very dry, desolate, harsh, remote conditions. And Australia does have an expertise. Some people think that it's all about just still people doing these things. A lot of these machines in these places are robotically driven. In the Pilbara in Australia, it's the longest and largest robotic train, remote driven train that they bring it from the mine site to the port. So those are the sorts of things that are directly needed, and NASA has clearly said we need to do this. So it's a way of making sure our efforts are fruitful.
And the centre's going to be called the Australian Remote Operations for Space and Earth. I think that's someone just wanting to create an acronym, which of course is AROS. It's going to be a key figure in the Australian National Partnership.
Yeah, look, every good organisation needs a good acronym. But, that's what it is. Space is not just about putting people and astronauts on the ground. It's doing these things, remotely and robotically. So, you hope that it translates well, and, maybe in the aerospace sector, I think, they're trying to be quite open-ended about it. But you hope that also in the end, it brings not only money and investment into, in this case, Western Australia, but jobs as well.
And the thing I really love is that the director of AROS is a former NASA astronaut, Colonel Pamela Melroy.
Yeah, and this is kind of what you're starting to see is that some of these, the expertise from the U.S. and other places is working with Australia to get things up and running. It's not just doing it ourselves. And that's because there's clearly an interest from overseas to help support Australia. The Australian Space Agency, the biggest thing it did was show that Australia is serious about space at a government level, and as these various state governments join on, it's also a commitment to show that the states are, invested in it. But at the same time, it's a way of, we end up being a safe bet that we can do things in a way that is safely, efficiently, and the money's not going to just disappear, because that's a big question. Overseas groups don't want to work with us and rely on us, and then all of a sudden, things are cut and it disappears. They want that commitment for the long term. And, these sorts of things are the things that build not just security, but a relationship that goes into the future.
Well, these last 4 episodes have been made possible by our sponsor, spaceaustralia.com. And of course, each of the guests who zoomed in for a chat, Dr. Jason Held from Sabre Astronautics, discussing their directive to build Australia's mission control. Human Aerospace's Chief Engineer James Waldy chatting about their designs for the next generation spacesuits. And on the last episode, co-CEO of Gilmore Space, Adam Gilmore, spoke about their hybrid engine, which will someday be paired with an Aussie rocket to take us into orbit from Australia. Well, it's been fascinating to dive into each of these stories and get to know exactly what Australia is contributing to the global space endeavour. Aussie Space Month will return next year. But from the next Trekzone Conversation, episode number 424, get set for August. That's right, August. Trekzone is supporting Guide Dogs Australia in their fundraising efforts, and I'm really hopeful that you can help us help them, which would be absolutely fantastic. The socials, don't forget, Trekzone is all over Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Tumblr, as well as YouTube. It's where we primarily release our episodes, as well as Facebook. Watch, ring the bell on YouTube, like, follow and subscribe on all the other socials to never miss a moment from Australia's Trekzone.org. On YouTube, give us a thumbs up if you like this video. If not, well, I guess the other button seems to work just as well. For now, though, I'm Matt Miller. Thanks so much for watching. We'll catch you on the next edition of a Trekzone podcast.